few weeks ago, my wife and I were at the symphony. We were running a little bit late. Downstairs, the lounge was empty where I was waiting. I looked up from my phone, because what do you do when you're waiting but look at your phone? I looked up and I saw a man that I didn't recognize approach me with a lot of intention, and I got a bit nervous. He came close, his hand reached out to shake mine, and he pulled me in a kind of conspiratorial manner. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" I inquired, a bit surprised. "You know," he said, "for wearing a kippah in public." And then he quickly left, leaving me a bit stunned. Now, I've never considered wearing a kippah to be an act of courage, at least not here in America. And I certainly do not consider it to be strange to be conspicuously Jewish going to the symphony at the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall. But if I understood that brief encounter, if I understood it correctly, it wasn't actually a concern for the reality of danger, but the perception of danger that my admirer was reacting to. We have to admit, something has changed. Now, I've spoken before about my experiences being easily identified as a Jew. I've worn a kippah in public for 35 years since I first made the decision to be a rabbi. It was not, as I have said before, an intention to declare a certain level of religious observance. It was and is a statement of wanting to be identified as a Jew in normal daily activities, to be part of normalizing Jewish identity and Jewish visibility. Oh, Jews go to the movies. Jews ride bikes along Tom McCall Waterfront Parkway. They kayak on Tillium Lake. Wow. I've talked before about the strange experiences that I've had wearing a kippah in Europe and being advised to remove it for my own safety, which I didn't do. And so yes, I do understand that at times being publicly identified as a Jew can be seen as an act of defiance. But I never thought to experience it here in Portland by another Jew. And to be honest, I really reject that idea of public Jewish identity requiring courage or an act of defiance. But this past year has shaken the Jewish community in many ways. In Israel, the feeling of invincibility was shattered by the terrorist brutality of October 7th. Here in America, we've been shaken by the college protests which have verged onto anti-Semitism. Jewish students who felt targeted not because of their actual political beliefs, but simply because they were identified as being Jewish. The truth is, all of this didn't begin a year ago, October 7th. It has been building for decades. The BDS movement, a Palestinian project founded in 2001, which seeks to delegitimize Israel and turn it into a pariah state, laid the ground for last spring's campus sit-ins. We've grown accustomed to anti-Semitism as being an artifact of the far right, from Holocaust denialism to the delusional Jewish replacement theory, all the way to Jewish space lasers causing forest fires, and recently that we've given the government the ability to control the weather, which makes me wonder why we would target Florida. Our Bubbies and Zadies are there. I don't know. But this ancient Jewish hatred paints Jews as both subhuman and supremely powerful, manipulating world events from the shadows. It is that story of exceptionalism, of Jews as utterly wicked outsiders, which has been used to justify the murder and dislocation of Jews for centuries. Here in America, we have, as I said correctly, tended to locate that hatred in the far-right white supremacy and Christian nationalism movements. But what has been building for years, and what has been brought into the light this past year, has been the growing anti-Semitism of the left, often in the guise of anti-Zionism, which has painted both Israel and the Jewish people as uniquely evil. This doesn't mean that all criticism of Israel is anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic, but we know when it verges into that realm. When Israel, the only nation in the world for whom the accepted solution for its crimes is its total destruction and the genocide of its people. For me, much of the pain of this past year has been experiencing some progressive colleagues with whom I've worked for years on issues of social justice, turning their backs on me, more importantly on the Jewish community, following October 7th. Sometimes using terminology invented by genocidal terrorists as if it was commonly accepted truth, accusing all Jews of enabling genocide. This spring, a student group at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law published an anti-Semitic cartoon of Jewish law school dean Erwin Chemerinsky, who's spoken from this very bima, holding a knife and a fork in this cartoon, supposedly dripping with the blood of Gazan children, echoing the anti-Semitic medieval blood libel. What has been hurtful in the midst of this resurgence is the denial of Jewish pain, of Jewish vulnerability, a refusal to recognize Jews as a persecuted minority. Even worse for me has been the treatment of some of our children, from middle school through college, even elementary school children who felt ostracized and targeted simply for being Jewish, a reality which would be unacceptable in progressive spaces for any other ethnic or religious group. But while this year has been painful for me and for so many of us, I do not believe that this is our new reality or that we have to accept it as a given. I refuse to give up on America. I refuse to give up on progressive values. I do not believe that being publicly identified as a Jew should be an act of defiance. Just before Rosh Hashanah, we were privileged to be host for a lecture by Atlantic writer Franklin Foer. As a speaker at our annual Osran Family Lecture, Foer spoke from this bima about his recent article in The Atlantic, which he is now turning into a book, entitled "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." This was one of our best attended Osran family lectures in many years. I suspect, as I said that evening, that it was because we love bad news. And especially for us Jews, we love news about our imminent demise. Ford posits that the 20th century was a kind of vacation from history for American Jews. Anti-Semitism during that time was pushed to the hidden fringes from the 1970s through, he thinks, around the year 2000. But with the rise of conspiracy theories following 9/11, which saw a mainstreaming of suspicion that somehow Israel's Mossad was behind the felling of the Twin Towers, through to the financial crisis of 2008, which was blamed on Jewish financiers, continuing through the suspicion of a Jewish plot behind the migrant caravans of 2018, the displacement of the image of Jews from the center of culture and science back to the ancient canard of Jewish plotting and the manipulation of world events, indicates to Ford that the golden age of American Jews is coming to a close. October 7th and the war against Hamas in Gaza has brought the progressive left into the publicly anti-Jewish camp. As Ford wrote in his article, America's ascendant political movements, MAGA on one side and the illiberal left on the other, would demolish the last pillars of the consensus that Jews helped to establish. They regard concepts such as tolerance, fairness, meritocracy, and cosmopolitanism as pernicious shams. The golden age of American Jewry, he writes, has given way to a golden age of conspiracy, reckless hyperbole, and political violence, all tendencies unmissable to the democratic temperament. Extremist thought and mob behavior have never been good for the Jews. It's hard to argue with Ford's position, reflected as it is by so many writers, including Dara Horn in her provocatively titled People Love Dead Jews, and our own lived experience, especially since October 7th. We cannot close our eyes when the FBI reports that the Jewish community remains the most targeted religious group in the country, with anti-Jewish hate crimes accounting for 67% of all religiously motivated hate crimes, despite our being only 2.4% of the American population. And the FBI is reporting a 21% increase in anti-Jewish crimes since October 7th, 2023. We cannot close our eyes when classic anti-Semitic tropes are used against immigrants accused by a presidential candidate and his running mate of eating cats and dogs, which echoes again the blood libel used against medieval Jews. We know that what is bad for immigrants in America tends to rebound to the Jew, the ultimate outsider. We can ignore when that same candidate, preparing the ground for an electoral loss by preemptively declaring that the Jewish community will be to blame for that loss. This elevation of the other narrative, the other being both subhuman and superempowered, has moved from the fringes to the center of political discourse. And on the left, the intellectual attempt to put all of world history into the simple categories of oppressor and oppressed has turned the progressive story of Zionism into the world's leading example of colonialism and genocide, marking Israel as uniquely evil and worthy of elimination, while at the same time ignoring real examples of genocide, war, and starvation around the world. As New York Times columnist and former Osram Lecture Series speaker Bret Stephens wrote just last week, after October 7th, it became personal. It was in the neighborhoods in which we lived, the professions and institutions in which we worked, the colleagues we worked alongside, the peers with whom we socialized, the chat groups to which we belonged, the causes to which we donated, the high schools and universities our kids attended. The call was coming from inside the house. Great. Using a horror movie reference to highlight the modern Jewish condition. How Jewish. And yet, although I acknowledge the reality and the experience of so many, including my own reality, I am not yet ready to declare the end of the American Jewish era. Having been a rabbi for 30 years now, I have seen many predictions of doom come and go. The very founding of the Reform movement over 200 years ago, according to some, was supposed to herald the end of the Jewish people. And yet, here we still are. Assimilation into America was our fated demise. Intermarriage was supposed to seal the deal. And yet, Judaism, and particularly Reform Judaism, thrives and innovates and grows. Reform remains the largest Jewish denomination in America, with nearly half of today's Reformed Jews coming from outside the movement. They are joining us. The synagogue, as an institution, has been declared dead so many times I can't even keep count. And yet we continue to be the center of Jewish life, teaching Jewish pride to the next generation and strengthening Jewish individuals and families for generations to come. And if popular culture is any guide, we Jews in America are still growing strong. In the golden age of the Broadway musical, Jewish producers, composers, and directors, most of the producers, composers, and directors of Broadway were Jewish. But at that time, they didn't think that they could tell a Jewish story. And then in 1964, they opened a little musical depicting a romanticized version of a Jewish shtetl based on a series of short stories by a Yiddish author, Shalom Aleichem. Fiddler on the Roof, of course, became one of the most beloved and commercially successful productions of all times. We learned Jewish stories could be told. When we visited New York last year, we saw a Broadway revival of a modern musical, Parade, which tells the real-life story of Leo Frank, the only Jewish person to be lynched in America. Our Jewish stories are being told, and they're being told more and more honestly. Franklin Ford declared the height of Jewish acceptance to be the 1978 network broadcast, The Stars Salute Israel at 30, with the climactic moment being Barbra Streisand singing the Israeli national anthem and interviewing then Prime Minister Golda Meir, the two most famous Jewish women in the world on live network television celebrating the Jewish state. And while I wouldn't expect to see something like that today, unless Josh Shapiro wants to sing a duet with Bibi Netanyahu, I don't actually see that happening, but who knows? I do see one barometer: Jewish characters on TV being portrayed in more realistic, less stereotypical circumstances. Ida knows how much I love to complain about how rabbis are depicted in movies and TV. From 6 Feet Under to last year's You're Not So Invited to My Bat Mitzvah, Nebuch. I do make an exception for Adam Brody's portrayal of the hot rabbi in Netflix's Nobody Wants It. I'm fine with the hot rabbi. I know, I'm really the really boring head rabbi of that series, but I can dream. A guy can dream. The fact is that there are more Jewish-themed TV shows and movies around now than I've ever seen. And unlike the Seinfeld crowd, these Jews are often portrayed as Jewishly engaged and living complex, authentic Jewish lives. As Bret Stephens suggested, I think the true answer to American anti-Semitism from the left or the right is not to hide our heads in the sand or to declare that all hope is lost. We Jews are good at both of those extremes. And it's not to live in fear, but instead to live proudly as Jews, to deepen our Jewish knowledge, our experiences, our connections to Jewish community. As Stephens wrote, "To have been born a Jew is the single most fortunate thing that ever happened to me. It is a priceless, moral, spiritual, intellectual, and emotional inheritance from my ancestors, some of whom were slaughtered for it. It is a precious bequest to my children, who will find different ways to make it their own. It is therefore worth the time it takes to explore and worth the cost, including, tragically, the cost in bigotry and violence that it so often extracts." This, I believe, is the Jewish impulse and image that we are adopting. A pride in our peoplehood, a desire to reconnect. Synagogues and federations around the country are reporting what is being called the surge, a return of Jews to Judaism. Many stories are being told of Jewish people who have reconnected since October 7th. Cantor Cahana had a lovely encounter not long ago with a woman who had not been at services before, that she had not seen at services before. "I've been away from my synagogue for 20 years, the woman said, and now I feel the need to be with my people." To which Cantor Cahana replied, "Welcome home." This year we started a new young adult program, begun by our own Chelsea, called Omek, which means depth. Some 30 young people in their 20s and 30s are finding depth in their adult exploration of Judaism and its meaning in their lives. Welcome home. We're seeing a rise in the number of older adults in our community connecting and exploring Judaism through art and culture. Welcome home. Many of you here are a part of our new Circles program, championed by our immediate past president, Libby Schwartz. Welcome home. Some of you are here today or watching online. You may be part of this surge, that we're seeing nationally and locally, coming back here, or maybe you are here for the first time. Welcome home. Judaism and Jewish life here are thriving. I think of the encounter that I had at the symphony as being symbolic of the fear that we've internalized from the rise of anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. I understand that fear. But I believe it should not restrict us. It should instead encourage us to find more depth and connection to our Judaism. I continue to wear a kippah in public, not as an act of defiance that needs to be congratulated, but as a statement of Jewish identity and pride, which I celebrate. We should not be afraid to wear a kippah or a Magen David or to put a mezuzah on our door or any other outward sign of Jewish identity. While we are aware and weary and wary, I believe that the Jewish story in America is still being written and that we continue to have so much to contribute to America's own story as a thriving, vibrant, proudly identified Jewish community. Anti-Semitism will remain, waxing and waning as it always has. But we will continue to be proud. There's a short phrase from the prayer book, which is recited several times a day, and especially said before going to bed and upon awakening. And it is even said upon entering the synagogue. Adonai li velo ira. God is with me, I will not fear. Our Jewish identity, the Jewish people are with me, I will not fear. We are together, proud in our Judaism. We will not fear. As we embrace those turning or returning or surging to Judaism, let us all be that resurgence of Jewish pride. Ken Yiratzon, may it be God's will.